Тепер ми переходимо до третьої секції. Єврейська національна персональна автономія в Україні 1917-1920 роки. Модерує секцію Максим Вон.
Шановні пані та панове, я висловлю суб'єктивну думку. Мені здається, що проблематика цієї секції єврейської національної персональної автономії в Україні – це своєрідна родзинка, як свого часу любив казати професор Феллер, Україну Юдайки, і відразу скажу, що для мене викликає великий подив те, що в шкільних і вузівських підручниках з історії України тема єврейської національної персональної автономії практично не присутня. Це рідкий вчений, який пише підручник з історії України, знає цей нюанс, яким можна пишатися, оскільки це одна з перших автономій того часу в масштабах Європи. Ну, тим не менш, маємо, як казав класик, те, що маємо. Я маю честь запросити до слова, до доповіді Борриса Kuzmany з темою творення єврейської національної персональної автономії. Цього разу ми можемо сміливо казати про те, що 20-25 хвилин у доповідачів є і приблизно до 10 хвилин на запитання і відповіді. Будь ласка.
Дякую. Дякую за запрошення. Я з організаторами домовився, що я буду говорити англійською, але потім ми можемо зробити дискусію по-українськи і не краще по-російськи, а можна і по-українськи. Okay, what I'm presenting you today is a part of my larger research on the history of national personal autonomy as a political concept that circulated in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. And one part of this story relates to the Ukrainian People's Republic. The key date for this paper is January 24, 1918, because on this very date, Central Rada passed the law on national personal autonomy for the Ukrainian People's Republic major nationalities, which were the Russians, the Jews, and the Poles. And it was approved anonymously, just several hours before the Ukrainian parliament declared its independence in the 4th Universal. Today, I'm not going to talk about the exact legal provisions of this law, not least because I think Anastasia will speak about this in around half an hour. In the first part of my talk, I want to speak about the law's prehistory, about the intellectual background of this story, and in the second part I will sketch what were the concrete measures the Jewish ministry undertook to implement this autonomy. So let me start with the first part. I see two intertwined intellectual roots that made it possible that in revolutionary Ukraine in 1917, all major parties were in favor of such a law. First, the specificities of the Ukrainian national movement, and second, the influence of Austro-Marxist theories as manifest in the program of the Jewish labor movement. So let me start with the Ukrainian national movement that already in the late 19th century we can observe their claim to a Ukraine national territory. And its proponents, from Drahomanov to Khrushchevsky to Bosch, they all wanted to reach this goal via decentralization of the Russian Empire. And they all emphasized the importance of the local level, the Hromada. And I think this concentration on the community level made it easier for them, for the agents of the Ukrainian national movement, to concede the same community autonomy to non-Ukrainian groups on their future Ukrainian territory. After the failed revolution of 1905, many Ukrainian leftist activists quit Russia for Galicia. And in exile, they got in closer touch with Austro-Marxist ideas and actually arranged the translation of their works into Russian and into Ukrainian. And they also must have been in touch with the Ukrainian National Democrats, a party in Galicia that was actually founded by Khrushchevsky, who was then professor at the University of Lviv. And this the Ukrainian National Democrats are very interesting because they negotiated a compromise between Poles and Ukrainians, Ruthenians as they called it at the time, in Galicia in 1914 that comprised elements of national personal autonomy. You can imagine 1914 is not the best time to start a new thing, but so this party was engaged in these discussions. And I mentioned Khrushchevsky, and Khrushchevsky in his article of 1913, Nationalne Temы, there he demonstrates that he knew very well the writings of Otto Bauer and Rudolf Springer. Actually, Rudolf Springer is the pseudonym of Karl Renner and other Austro-Marxists. So we see here the second intellectual root of the 1918 Ukrainian law, and these are the Austro-Marxists. Actually, right after the adoption of the law, the Minister for Jewish Affairs, Moshe Silberfarb, referred to the Brno Party meeting of the Austrian Social Democratic Party in 1899. And it's true, at that party congress, national personal autonomy was discussed for the first time very openly, but and this might be an irony, at that point it was not accepted as the Austrian Social Democrats' party program. But indeed, the Ukrainian law of 1918 was faithful to the ideas, to the theoretical writings of the Austro-Marxists, with two big differences. Renner and Bauer proposed to reorganize the entire Habsburg monarchy on the basis of national personal autonomy, whereas in the Ukrainian People's Republic, it was a minority protection tool. And the second big difference is the question of national autonomy for the Jews. And here, the role of the Jewish Labor Movement comes in, and the role of its most important theoretical theorist, Vladimir Medem. The Bund's role seems crucial for me in two aspects. First, Medem adapted the Austro-Marxist ideas to Jewish needs in Eastern Europe. Renner and Bauer claimed very directly that Jews should not be considered a nationality, and they explicitly say that Jews should not have the right to national personal autonomy. And Medem says, no, this is not right. He translates it, he culturally translates it to Eastern European Jewry and says, no, this is exactly the system we need in the Russian Empire, because Jews are scattered all over the country. And the second important role I see that the Bund played in this story is the fact that the Bund was in very close contact to the entire socialist spectrum in the Russian Empire, and the Bund tried to influence these other parties. And indeed, by 1917, all parties of the democratic left in the Russian Empire had embraced national personal autonomy for the country's minorities. From the social revolutionaries to the Mensheviki, to the Georgian Mensheviki, and especially to Ukrainian leftist parties. And this became very important in the time of the Ukrainian Revolution, where the rather weak Central Rada tried to increase its power, and therefore had to come in a way had to come to terms with the national minorities. So, actually, I think if we want to understand why Jewish activists more or less anonymously favored national personal autonomy, we have to consider also a third root, a Jewish root of this law, and this is the century-old Jewish religious community autonomy. Politically active Jews were conscious about these connections, and we see this from a document of the Vice Secretary for Jewish Affairs from autumn 1917, where he states that for 200 years in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth there existed autonomous national institutions on the central state level, the Ba'at, and on the community level, the Kehilas. However, this document underlines that, that this historical Jewish autonomy was neither democratic within its autonomous structures, nor was it intended to guarantee civil rights equality. Whereas the Ukrainian law aimed at both at national self-administration and civil rights for all Jewish citizens of Ukraine. The party that is most directly linked to the renewal of this traditional Jewish autonomy was the moderately left-wing Jewish People's Party, the so-called Volkspartei. And I had to bring it in because it's that's the prehistory of the conference call that we all had with the that's a election poster of this party. In my paper's second part, I want to sketch the concrete things that happened during the revolutionary period in order to get a better understanding what Jewish autonomy really meant. Owing to Henry Abrahamson's book, happily we know already quite a lot, and I'm really very glad that this will be presented tonight in translation. The story starts back again in September 1917 with the introduction of vice secretariats for the three largest minority populations in Ukraine within the General Secretariat for Intranational Affairs, a Polish, a Russian, and a Jewish subject. So what were the activities of the Jewish ministry besides creating and professionalizing its own institutional structures? Their main tasks were to initiate a state-sponsored secular educational program based on the Yiddish language, then, of course, to raise the government's awareness to the ever-increasing pogroms, to reorganize the local Jewish communities, and to actually implement autonomous Jewish institutions. If we look at the staff members and on the money spent, we see that the Jewish ministry's education department was by far the most important. The cultural work initiated in these years had a decisive influence on Jewish cultural life in the decade to come. And actually not only in the Ukrainian People's Republic, but also later in the entire Soviet Union. As we know, as we heard in the earlier panel, with regard to the containment of pogroms, the Jewish ministry was far less successful. In my today's paper, I want to focus on the Jewish ministry's measures to implement autonomous Jewish structures. Because until now, I was talking about the activities of a ministry, but a ministry means having a voice in the government, a voice for Jewish needs, for Jewish concerns. But this is not self-rule, this is not self-administration. The Jewish parties, from the left to the right, they agreed the Jewish autonomy should rest upon two pillars: the local Jewish community, the so-called Kehila, and a representative central assembly, including an executive organ. The problem was that the ministry did not consider the existing local Jewish community councils legitimate, because they were not elected on a universal suffrage base. And what the ministry tried is they helped organizing local elections based on an equal and universal voting right. And indeed, in more than 1/3 of all Jewish communities in Ukraine, local elections were held during the year 1918. And this is quite astonishing because 1918 was a very difficult year to hold elections, with the governments changing all the time, with the permanent threat of pogroms. But still, in about 1/3 of the communal elections were held. The problem was that the outcome of these elections was a nuisance to the Jewish ministry. They were not happy with what came out. And here we have to stop thinking in terms of Jews and Gentiles, or Zionists and non-Zionists, but we must think in political categories of left and right. As we know, the Ukrainian People's Republic was a left-wing endeavor, and so was its government, and so was the Jewish ministry. The Minister for Jewish Affairs, Moshe Silberfarb, was a member of the Vereinigte, the United Jewish Socialist Workers' Party, and the departments within the Jewish ministry were led by Bundist, a Poale Zionist, and by a representative of the small Volkspartei. So the problem was that in the local elections, they showed all left-wing parties together had a lower score than the non-socialist Zionists, and together with their allies from the religious parties, the Zionists had a clear majority. So why do I stress the importance of these local elections so much? The reason for this was that the local Kehillas should send around 2/3 of the delegates to the planned provisionary Jewish National Assembly, which should convene in autumn 1918, the so-called Vorparlament. The other seats of the provisionary assembly were taken by representatives of the Jewish Council. The Jewish National Council had actually been installed already in autumn 1917 by the Jewish ministry as a consultative body that should represent the democratic Jewish political spectrum. The tricky thing is the word democratic, because in the terms of a left-wing revolution, as we have in Ukraine at that time, the word democratic was a means not to allow the representation of religious parties and to reduce, or to at least to have the Zionists, the non-socialist Zionists being underrepresented. But what happened at that moment was that the Zionists said, no, under these conditions, we will not go into the Jewish National Council, which also created a problem for the Jewish ministry, because without the Zionists, if the Zionists boycotted the Jewish National Assembly, it would delegitimize this institution. So eventually the Jewish ministry gave in and conceded half of the seats in the National Jewish Council to the Zionists and its allies. And as I said before, the provisionary Jewish National Assembly, in 1918, it consisted partly of delegates from the Jewish National Council, where the Zionists held 50%, and representatives from the local Kehillas, where the Zionists scored so successfully during the elections in 1918. So, the provisionary Jewish National Assembly and its executive organ, the Jewish National Secretariat, eventually became a Zionist stronghold, whereas the ministry was a socialist power tool. So, not surprisingly, this ideological issue So not surprisingly, the ideological issue came up again when the Hetmanate was overthrown, and because Skoropadsky had banned national personal autonomy as well as the national ministries, but the Directorate legally reinstituted national personal autonomy in late 1918. And especially socialist Jewish parties were again in favor of renewing the Jewish ministry. And being in the same socialist camp, the Directorate conceded the Jewish ministry to the Bundists. And here my paper comes full circle. In protest to this decision to have a new Jewish ministry, the Jewish National Secretariat, which was dominated by the Zionists, addressed the Directorate directly. In a letter, the Secretariat demanded that the Jewish ministry should be abolished, and for the entire communication between the Ukrainian government and the Jewish autonomous bodies, the Jewish autonomous bodies should nominate a Secretary of State. And in order to underline their claim, they say, this is exactly what the Austro-Marxists had proposed. So they did not only demonstrate that they knew about the origins of national personal autonomy, but they also hoped that referring to the Austro-Marxists would strengthen their claim vis-à-vis the socialist Ukrainian government. So, to sum up, what I wanted to demonstrate in my paper was where the entangled intellectual origins of the 1918 Ukrainian law on national personal autonomy. I think we can observe the basic reciprocity of such an idea owing to the Ukrainian national movement's emphasis on the local community. We have a strong influence of Austro-Marxist ideas and a long-established familiarity of Jews with some sort of Jewish self-rule. In my paper's second part, I sketched the line from the idea of a Jewish national autonomy towards its implementation. I underlined the political and ideological differences of a Jewish ministry that wanted to be part of the general Ukrainian government and the Jewish National Assembly that wanted to govern only the Jews of Ukraine. And I think we therefore must not forget that the entire history of national personal autonomy in the years of the first independent Ukrainian state should be as much discussed in political left-right dimension as it is usually discussed in the ethnic majority-minority dimension and the Zionist non-Zionist dimension. Thank you for your attention.
Шановні пані та панове, це той дивний випадок, коли не треба доповідача зупиняти. І маємо, принаймні, повноцінних 10 хвилин на питання і відповіді. Будь ласка. Анастасія, будь ласка.
Дякую, пане Юрій, це дуже цікава доповідь. Наскільки я зрозуміла, ви виводите теорію, тобто національну персональну автономію, втілювану у УНР, абсолютно з концепції Бауера-Шплінгера. Яким чином ви вважаєте, з цією теорією корелює концепція Дубнова, розроблена щодо також розроблена концепція національної персональної автономії, якою користувалося російське єврейство і, зокрема, і українське, як частина загальноросійського єврейства. Дякую.
Може бути, це було не так ясно в доповіді. Я не думаю, що це було тільки автомарксисти, я думаю, що це було дуже важливо, особливо по УНР це більш-менш соціал-демократичне виявлення, як і автомарксисти. Значить, так пасує дуже, чи ідеологічні думки są близькі, тоді завжди легше прийняти щось. Але те, що я показувала з плакатом, я думаю, що Volkspartei і як основитель по-українськи? Засновник цієї партії, це був Дубнов. Значить, для України або для Російської імперії, я думаю, що це має вплив. Але не можна забути, що національна персональна автономія це була не тільки річ для євреїв, але це було і для поляків, і для як тоді взяли великоросіян. І я думаю, що для них Дубнов не мав не грав великої ролі. І те, що ми знаємо від поляків, вони там пишуть, що для них особливо ідеї автомарксистів і бундистів були дуже важливі. Але для євреїв це ви совершенно правильно, що Volkspartei новий мав свій участок.
Дякую.
Будь ласка, в кого ще є запитання? Поки пауза, я дозволю собі задати питання. Будьте добры, вот если предположить, что Центральная Рада выстояла, насколько приемлема для украинского общества была идея национальной персональной автономии? Я имею в виду то, что провозгласить легко, воплотить гораздо сложнее. Вот лет через 20 гипотетически существовала бы национальная персональная автономия, если бы Центральная Рада не была, скажем так, разрублена?
Я не 100% уверен, если я правильно понял ваш вопрос. Может быть, вы можете задать еще иншими словами, а то я
очень часто то, что декларируется, остается просто таким благим намерением, просто декларацией. Я сам себе задаю вопрос. Если бы украинское государство выстояло, лет через 20 национальная персональная автономия существовала бы, или украинский политикум нашел бы причины и механизмы для того, чтобы это свернуть? Ваше мнение?
Это случайно, Сара, это к тебе была бы, конечно, ипотетическая история. Честно говоря, я думаю, что да, потому что это помогает правительству. Потому что украинское правительство знало о еврейской общине. Почти ничего. Что там люди делают, что если какое там образование, это автономные структуры помогают и правительству влиять на это не прямо, но через автономные структуры. И кроме того, я думаю, это им не было, это не мешало. Это, конечно, трудно сказать, но мы знаем, например, из прибалтийских государств, где тоже были, в 25 году, особенно в Эстонии, там тоже был такой закон, и там 10 лет был этот закон, в принципе, до конца истории. И там, в принципе, более или менее работал такой же закон для немцев и для евреев. И, в принципе, и эстонское правительство примирилось с этим идеей. Конечно, трудно сказать, что было бы в УНР, но я думаю, что это не исключено, что это работало.
Спасибо. Панове, в кого ще є запитання? Нам залишається ще раз подякувати доповідачеві за